the house that packed up and left. One time in a quiet little neighborhood, there was a small house named Humphrey. Humphrey was no ordinary house. He had big windows that could blink like eyes, and a roof that wrinkled up when he was annoyed. But best of all, he had a front door that creaked loudly whenever he wanted attention. Humphrey had lived with his owner, Mrs. Tiddlywinks, for over 50 years. Mrs. Tiddlywinks loved her house, but sometimes, she just didn't listen. Humphrey had asked nicely for a new paint job, but Mrs. Tiddlywinks said, maybe next year. He'd asked for a bit more insulation in the attic, but she only gave him a new doormat. Doormats don't keep me warm, Humphrey huffed. One day, after a particularly chilly night with no extra insulation, Humphrey had had enough. That's it, he grumbled to himself. If Mrs. Tiddlywinks won't take care of me, I'll find someone who will. So, early the next morning, while Mrs. Tiddlywinks was still snoring away, Humphrey did the unthinkable. He stood up. Yes, all four corners of his foundation wobbled as he stretched, and his chimney popped up like a neck stretching after a long nap. Then, with a mighty heave, he lifted himself right off the ground. Mrs. Tiddlywinks' garden gnome, Gerald, woke up from the noise and gasped. Humphrey! What are you doing? Houses can't just walk away. Humphrey snorted, Watch me, Gerald. And off he went, stomping down the street, his windows blinking, and his door swinging in the breeze. As Humphrey marched through the neighborhood, people peeked out of their windows in shock. Is that a house walking down the street? One neighbor yelled. Must be the new smart homes, another mumbled, completely unfazed. Humphrey walked and walked, past the playground, past the park, and all the way to the countryside. He finally settled near a beautiful hill with a clear view of the sunset. This is the life, Humphrey sighed, feeling the breeze through his rafters. Meanwhile, back at Mrs. Tiddlywinks' home, or what used to be home, she woke up to find nothing. No roof, no walls, no doors. Just her bed and a very confused Gerald the gnome. Gerald! Mrs. Tiddlywinks cried. Where's my house? Well, said Gerald with a shrug, you didn't listen when it asked for a little paint, so it left. Mrs. Tiddlywinks couldn't believe it. Houses don't just leave. Tell that to Humphrey, Gerald smirked. You might want to check the countryside. He's probably relaxing by a hill somewhere. Mrs. Tiddlywinks, determined to get her house back, hopped on her bicycle and pedaled furiously out to the countryside. Sure enough, there was Humphrey, sitting by the hill, watching the sunset like a happy old man. Humphrey! Mrs. Tiddlywinks shouted. You come back right this instant. Humphrey turned his windows slowly toward her and gave a loud creak. Oh, now you notice me. I'm sorry. Mrs. Tiddlywinks pleaded. I'll paint you any color you want, and I'll add extra insulation to the attic. I promise. Just come back. Humphrey's shudders twitched. He thought about it. He did like Mrs. Tiddlywinks, even if she was a bit forgetful. Well, he muttered, only if I get to pick the paint color. No more mustard yellow. Mrs. Tiddlywinks agreed right away. Of course. You can be any color you want. All right, said Humphrey, lifting himself off the hill. Let's go home. And so, Humphrey the house walked back to the neighborhood, settling back into his foundation with a satisfied sigh. True to her word, Mrs. Tiddlywinks painted him the most beautiful shade of sky blue, and she even gave him a cozy attic makeover. From then on, Humphrey never had to ask twice for anything. And though he never left again, sometimes his door would swing wide open for no reason. "Just stretching," he'd say with a wink. And everyone lived happily ever after. Well, except Gerald the gnome, who still thought houses walking was the weirdest thing he'd ever seen.